Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, thank you folks so much for joining us today. We will definitely have some other folks hopping on, I'm sure, in the next few minutes. But my name is Chris Neidl. I am the co-founder of the OpenAir Collective and really excited just to welcome you today to today's workshop. We'll jump right into the program. Today's event as well is being put on together in partnership with OpenAir, Carbon Gap, and the Foundation for Climate Restoration. And you'll be hearing from folks from each of our groups during the course of the workshop. Today, what we're really excited about to talk about is about greenhouse gas removal support policies in the UK, but specifically with a lens to how do we actually catalyze and accelerate good policy in the United Kingdom. And there's a lot of exciting developments that are already happening in the UK around this. And what OpenAir, Carbon Gap, and the Foundation for Climate Restoration are really committed to is how does the public weigh in on this, and how do we actually accelerate progress so that we can see in the UK optimal CDR policies or greenhouse gas removal policies. So what I'm going to do is today, in addition to the agenda, which I'll go over right now, I really want to stress, hang tight for the hour, because the point here is really the call to action that we're going to talk about at the end, because we are trying to build a campaign. And so everybody who's joined today is welcome to be involved in that process. So Rory will preview it in a second, and then we'll provide some more details at the end of the hour. In terms of our program today, we're going to get into right now, Rory Brown, our co-host, will hop up, and he's going to give a kind of a basic overview of some of the fundamentals around what is greenhouse gas removal or carbon removal, and what is currently the landscape look like in the UK around greenhouse gas removal policy. And then we'll have a discussion that will be led by Carbon Gap's Eli Mitchell-Larson with a couple of subject experts, where we're going to talk about some of the material that Rory presented, and then really get into the questions of where are the gaps, where can UK GGR policy be made more effective, and what is the role of civil society to push for those changes. And then we'll take the last few minutes of the call to really get into that call for action. We have a very specific next step for our campaign, and we're going to provide some information about that, and again, how you can be involved. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my co-host and very active OpenAir member, Rory Brown, who's in London, who's going to kick us off with the initial presentation. Take it away, Rory.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. So just to give you the preview, the sort of the driver of this was in part the release of the consultation on engineered greenhouse gas business models a few weeks ago, due end of September. So this is something that we really want to capitalize on as a window of opportunity. So that's something I'll come back to in a bit, and we'll describe in the presentation. So just for those that may be newer to this area, it is a new, rapidly evolving and quite complex area. So we wanted to just do the fundamentals very quickly. So for those of you more familiar, please bear with us for a few minutes. So what are greenhouse gas removals? This is quite a UK term. It's I think more widely described as carbon dioxide removal. That's very much, of course, the central greenhouse gas that is being focused on at the moment for removals. And this is defined, this is from the IPCC 1.5 report, as activities that remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and durably store them in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs, or in products. And the key bits of this are from the atmosphere rather than point source emissions, and the durable storage of them in those reservoirs or products. There's a range of different methods across a really wide spectrum, and they are rapidly evolving at the moment. So just to do a quick canter through them, there are land sinks, that's storage in things like forests, soil, peat, and mangroves. There is durable biostorage, which is things like biochar, bio-oil, biomass with carbon removal and storage, BECCS, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and actually spans a real range of applications from power to industry and other types. And then some of the more, so there are also now, of course, ocean-based methods, such as the sinking of algae. There's also mineralization, which is the acceleration of natural geophysical processes of the sequestration of CO2 in rock, typically. And of course, many of you may have heard about direct air capture, which has also a rapidly expanding range of technological approaches, but which typically must be chained to durable storage, or in reservoirs or in products for it to count as a GGR. Just to say quickly, of course, removals is just one of the aspects of climate policy, and at OpenAir, Carbon Gap, and the Foundation for Climate Restoration, we think about them really in these three buckets. And of course, emissions reduction is absolutely central, in many ways likely to be the main effort. Adaptation too, as we've just seen in the UK, with temperatures being breached by the poetic number of temperature records, being breached by the poetic number of 1.5 degrees just on Tuesday. But then removals as an additional complement, which has a range of different applications or different utilities, from now forward, as the sort of dynamic around emissions and impacts changes through this century. Just in terms of the recognition of this, now in the latest round of the IPCC's assessment reports, they've been pretty clear. They use the language unavoidable or unnecessary in the mitigation report that came out, when was it, a couple months ago? And in the impact report, there's a pretty good summation that we wanted to pull out, saying that the ambitious temperature targets agreed upon in Paris will require at least some CDR. All 1.5 pathways feature annual removals at gigaton levels, and the cumulative estimated requirement for this century is between 100 billion tons and 1,000 billion tons, i.e. a trillion, which is a very large amount, and a very rapid upscaling. So, as we know from renewables, batteries and EVs, and frankly from the fossil fuel industry itself, scale takes time, and the scale of carbon removal that will be required within the next 3 decades or so is probably akin to the scale of the oil and gas industry today. But we also know from things like renewables that good policy can really accelerate upscaling, particularly at the early stages around supporting demonstration and deployment, and then cost reductions at the pre-commercial and early commercial stages of that deployment in particular. So with all of that being said, to move to the UK landscape, the big picture really is that the UK has recognized the importance of GGR, especially engineered approaches such as DAC and BECS, and has put in place ambitious targets and a series of policies and investments to support those. So these are the current estimated, the current policy targets. It's 5 million tons of CO2 removed by 2030 for engineered removals specifically, 23 by 2035, and a range of 75 to 81 by mid-century, which is about 50% higher than the Climate Change Committee's recommendation for that particular target. So it's an aggressive and ambitious set of targets from effectively the zero that exists today in the UK. The policy backdrop, as many of you will know, of course, the Climate Change Act, and particularly its net zero amendment, target amendment in 2019 is absolutely crucial for this. And then more recently, under the current government, there was the net zero strategy last year, which had a whole section specifically on GGR. And then just in the last few weeks, the Energy Security Bill was introduced to Parliament and is currently going through its second reading, I think, which includes some elements that are very much relevant to removals, including actually changing the fundamental definition of removals to bring it from outside of just the land use sector to include all processes, including engineered types. And then under each of these sort of big picture, tentpole policies and pieces of legislation, there are a range of developing commitments, and I'll just canter through each of these three quickly. So on the market side first, there are already markets for woodland, for forests and for peat. They're called the carbon codes for each of those. that's not a hugely clear name. In fact, it's a registry, a trading platform, and a set of quite closely government regulated standards for the trading of credits in each of those domains. And more recently, the UK is now considering the appropriate long-term market for engineered GGR and potentially other methods too. The consultation that they put out on the UK ETS, which closed a few weeks ago, was exploring the possible integration into the ETS, as well as options around a government-regulated compliance market or a reliance on voluntary markets with more or less government regulation a possibility. And then quickly, just on the net zero clusters, this is really important because it's connected to both industrial decarbonization and GGR. So like the United States, the UK is taking a kind of spatial approach, but unlike the United States with its DAC hubs, they're looking at the co-location of CO2 transportation and storage infrastructure to serve both industrial CCS and engineered removals. And the first two clusters that were selected, one in the East Coast, called the East Coast Cluster, and one on the Irish Sea called HyNet, which will have CO2 transportation and storage pipelines serving both of those uses in place by the mid-2020s, with two more clusters and their associated transportation and storage infrastructure in place by the end of the decade to meet the first pieces of kind of legislated targets. And really interestingly, in June, a new licensing round for CO2 storage sites for private operators was announced. This will be, in addition to the government-backed transportation and storage operator that's going to be connected to the clusters. But this is really quite an exciting development, actually, because it allows for private companies to bid on putting in place the storage sites, which would, on the expectation that they would be able to then generate revenue from people that have removed or captured CO2, who would then provide it to them as the off-taker. So it's sort of the last, the demand side piece of that, the whole value chain from capture through to storage. Actually is a really interesting development. And then finally, just on the innovation support side, the technology push piece, there is a government DAC innovation program. The phase 1 was completed earlier this year, and the phase 2 awardees were announced just a few weeks back. There are a mix of big, existing kind of well-known UK industrial companies, universities, and some kind of DAC-specific startups. There is also a biomass feedstocks innovation program, important because the UK is going for BECCS, but has very limited biomass stocks on the island. And so they're looking for innovative ways of developing greater domestic biomass production in order to feed that BECCS, the expected BECCS from a range of things, from sort of power across to industry, a range of different BECCS methods. They've also funded a program called CORE, of which Emily, who you'll hear from in a moment, and I are both a part of, which is the sort of primary science and policy research and analysis hub for GGR. And under the core, actually, there is also a set of demonstrators for land-based biological or hybrid type GGR methods, which cover the following, as you can see here: enhanced rock weathering, peatland restoration, perennial biomass crops, biochar, and woodland creation and management. Now, the most recent piece, which is very much building on all of what I've described to date, is something I said at the top about the business model consultation. It's not a very good term because it sounds like business models is the model for an individual business. But I suppose the way to think about it is they're looking at what the businesses need to be able to scale and providing the policy support to be able to do that. And in particular, they've identified that a stable revenue stream is crucial to be able to scale engineered removals in particular, given the broad absence of an ability to sell those on. It doesn't have an obvious revenue stream, unlike even some of the hybrid approaches like BECCS. But so just to read these two quotes, which I think are really, really capture it. This consultation has confirmed the government's intention to commercialize a diverse mix of GGR technologies and develop a technology-neutral negative emissions market. Government intervention will be essential to stimulate the growth of the GGR sector at the pace and scale needed to achieve our ambitions over the coming decade. And they've proposed this upscaling through a near-term contracts-based approach, as they've described it, prior to the potential integration into a wider market mechanism. And the consultation is very much focused on getting views on what type of contracts-based approach. And they've laid out three options, which I'll just name, but won't go into any great detail on. A negative emissions contract for difference, which might be familiar to those of you from an energy background, a negative emissions payment, and a negative emissions guarantee, which is a backstop in case people are not able to sell those negative emissions to a private market provider. So I'm going to draw it to a close there and hand over to Eli, and he will introduce our panelists, I'm sure.
Thank you, Rory, for that excellent and comprehensive rundown. Thank you so much. I'm Eli Mitchell-Larson from Carbon Gap and also Axer Net Zero. And what we want to do now is have, let's call it a facilitated discussion, because we want everybody to get involved. And apologies that there's an issue with the sort of speak to everyone function of the chat. Just send your questions to Q&A, and Chris and I will triage those and get those to Mike and Emily Cox as well. So please keep them coming. And as a preview of the kind of call to action, what we're really trying to do here is get a broader group of people than the sort of insiders who kind of follow these policy developments down to the minutia involved in this process. So we do really want your questions at whatever level about how we should be responding to this consultation, as well as other greenhouse gas removal policy developments in the UK. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Emily Cox. Emily is a researcher working on energy systems and carbon removal with a particular interest in public attitudes, risk, and resilience. I would go a step further and say that Emily is one of, if not the leading researcher on this kind of question of public acceptability of greenhouse gas removal, particularly the stuff that takes big infrastructure potentially. She works at Oxford University as part of the UK GGR hub, particularly on, as I said, the perceptions of carbon removal. And she also works as a social psychologist at Cardiff University in the Understanding Risk Group, and as a researcher on energy security and disruption at the UK Energy Research Centre. Welcome, Emily. And Mike Hemsley leads the analysis for the Energy Transitions Commission, a diverse coalition of public, private, non-governmental, and academic stakeholders aiming at accelerating energy transitions globally. He previously worked at the UK's Committee on Climate Change, an independent advisor to the government, first of its kind, incredible institution, where he led the CCC's carbon budgets team, bringing together the CCC's analysis on sectoral emissions and leading work on cross-cutting decarbonization policy to feed into the UK's 6th carbon budget. And importantly, I should also mention that ETC, the Energy Transitions Commission, has been releasing some excellent content, kind of comprehensive reports on global CDR potential and progress. So maybe Jake can share that in the chat as well. Great work there. So what we're going to do is we're going to first talk about the GGR business models consultation that Rory previewed and things we should think about there, not just the nuts and bolts of the policy, but how do we communicate the benefits of the policy to the public? How do we engage them and involve them? Then I want us to talk about other areas of UK GGR policy, and throughout we'll be answering audience questions, but at the end we'll save some time to try to get to those. So first, I wondered if both you, Emily, and Mike could just dive in and give us kind of a high-level perspective on UK GGR policy. Is the UK a leader? Is it a laggard? And what do you think the opportunities, particularly for outside stakeholders, so people on this call and beyond, to actually engage with these topics? Maybe start with you, Mike. Awesome.
Yeah, sure. Happy to go first, and thanks very much for having me today. So I think I'd probably describe the UK as maybe a cautious leader on CDR. I think the UK kind of gets it, which is great, and I think it's really good that the UK government has actually put forward targets for greenhouse gas removal at certain dates in the future. Because in my years at the CC, all you get from industry is give us a long-term goal and we will act to meet it. And I think the UK has got that. I think they're also getting it in terms of, developing the business models, things like that. When you read this consultation, I think that the government's preferred option is probably also what developers want. It's some kind of fixed payments for removing emissions from the atmosphere. And I think that overall is a good start. I think that there are some other words of caution though. I think the UK has always told a good story on long-term targets and maybe not necessarily delivered against them. It's also had, a very varied track record when it comes to other policy areas, such as say carbon capture and storage, where they've previously had targets, previously developed things like business models, and it's not gone ahead for various reasons, including funding and maybe a kind of public apathy or a lack of public appetite for this. So I think the key challenge for this is justifying why greenhouse gas removals is important to the UK. And I think that is building on a recognition that we have, but I'm sure the public doesn't have, on the need to remove emissions as well as really rapidly reduce them. And then as part of that is getting a mandate for why there should be some public funding for greenhouse gas removals. I mean, the UK target is 5 million tons per year in 2030. If that costs £200 a ton, that's quickly £1 billion a year. Why should we? There are definitely things that the UK government spends more than £1 billion a year on, which the public has no idea about. Cleaning up toxic nuclear waste, for example, is $3 billion a year. But I think a better version is to explain to the public why we should have a mandate for spending that kind of money. And that comes down to a fundamental explanation of why we need removals alongside emissions reduction as well. So I think that's maybe where this group comes in a bit more, rather than the general audience for these kind of consultations, is giving that mandate, explaining why it's important. But yeah, the UK making good progress with some caution maybe on making sure that this program does actually deliver and leads to some overall funding as well.
Thanks. Over to you, Emily.
Yeah, I agree with absolutely everything that Mike just said. I think you're exactly spot on pointing out that the UK is really good at long-term targets and a little bit less good at all of the other bits. And there's been some drama recently with the net zero report and the success of the court case against the UK government, showing that it's actually illegal to publish that report without publishing the numbers that led to it, right? And this shows that the targets are one thing, but the actual numbers behind them are a much more challenging piece. And what's also interesting that's come out of that is that they now have to create a new net zero strategy. And explain where the missing 5% has gone, right? And so this opens up some really interesting space for CDR up to, I think, March 2023 is when they've got to publish that report. It's going to be really fascinating where that extra 5% comes from. I think another thing that Mike pointed out was this idea of, he briefly mentioned nuclear waste. And something that we've been kind of toying with recently is this idea of seeing carbon as a waste product. One of my colleagues, Steve Smith, is very fond of pointing to the Victoria Embankment in London, which was actually a massive sewage disposal project, right? It cost huge amounts of public money, and it was done because the water pollution and the sewage problem in London had become completely untenable, right? And so if we see carbon as a waste product, it creates a different framing of the problem, which maybe leaves some more space to seeing it as a public good issue rather than the market-based approach that we're currently taking. And just finally on this point, I wanted to draw your attention. There's a paper that was published by Felix Chenuit and a load of his colleagues, where they actually looked at carbon dioxide removal policy across 9 OECD countries, right? And the UK was one of them. And they say that the UK, compared to all their other countries, is a case of proactive CDR entrepreneurship. And none of the other countries studied have such explicit policy support for the development and deployment of various CDR measures. That's not how I'd read the global landscape, right? But they've done the research, they've done the case studies. So, I highly suggest that you check out that paper. It's in Frontiers Journal. Anyway, I'll wrap up. Oh, thank you, Christopher. Yeah, I can't post stuff in the chat. So if other people could post stuff for me, then.
That's great. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Mike. I think I'd love to stick for a moment with this question of communication, because I think, with CCS policy and other policies, I think it's been seen as a kind of one and done. Can we raise the $1 billion to get Peterhead over the line or something? But I think what we're talking about with this consultation, regardless of which option the government chooses, is payments over a very long period of time. That's the only way this will actually work, right? If there's that fixed contract and companies have that guarantee over a long time horizon. So it strikes me that necessitates maintaining political will. So I wondered if you could comment, particularly you, Emily, on kind of what are some strategies that the government or we as advocates could use to make sure that that's being communicated, or if there is anything to communicate. I mean, I think maybe stepping back a minute, the question is, what are the benefits that this policy delivers, and how do we communicate them in a way that's compelling and accurate?
I'm really sorry, I think I might have missed a bit. What are the benefits of which policy?
So Bay is asking in this consultation, how should we incentivize? And essentially, they're looking at higher durability carbon removal. So there's a great question in the chat from Sarmad that we're going to get to in a little bit, which is, how do we incentivize, what's the right policy fit for other greenhouse gas removal methods? But for the stuff that is expensive right now and essentially needs to be stored offshore, the government's proposal is, we'll pay a success fee. There's 3 different flavors of it, as Rory said. We don't know which one that we'll pick, but they'll do one of those, and it's going to have to happen over a long period of time. So what are the benefits that brings to UK society? And essentially, how do we make sure that political will is maintained? So it's a question of, this isn't a policy, as Mike was alluding to, policies that can kind of just disappear on the inside track and the public might not even hear about them. This is not one of those policies. This will exist for a long period of time. And so the public needs to understand it, and they need to believe that it's delivering something of value to them.
Yeah, I mean, God, that's a massive question with an awful lot of parts. So I'm going to try and just focus on, but I'm not a policy expert. And so I don't know about the particular benefits and drawbacks of particular policies, right? I know that a lot of people have been doing a lot of work looking into this, and there will be economists picking apart this consultation. And I think that's a really important job and not one that I have the expertise to do, unfortunately. I think an important comparison that I want to draw is with Hinkley Point C, right? And so my colleague Rob Bellamy wrote a paper where they basically looked at public support for BECCS, for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And most importantly, they looked at it in relation to a bunch of different policy scenarios of ways that you could support BECCS. And they found a particularly strong effect from the idea of a similar sort of mechanism to Hinkley Point C. And this is UK specific, right? Because we have this history where Hinkley Point C was paid for with a contract difference, it was paid for with a particularly high strike price. And the way that was widely portrayed in the media and that was widely perceived was that they were getting paid far too much for delivering something that ended up being very, very late and very far over budget, right? They're so late and so much has changed since that maybe it's not actually overpaying them. I don't know. I mean, it's going to be like another 10 years before they actually turn the thing on, right? So we'll see what happens there. But it was not perceived as good policy making across the general public. And Rob's paper found that actually people were really quite aware of that. There was high awareness of the Hinkley Point C problem, and it led to them perceiving BECCS policy in certain ways. And I worry a bit that this contract for difference is essentially going down the same road. I'm not sure that it is, but the idea is that it's technology agnostic, right? And the UK government has a particular way of talking very highly of technology neutral policies, whilst kind of actually doing the opposite, right? And so all these policies are supposed to be technology neutral, but in essence, a lot of them actually do pick winners. And the CFD for energy definitely picked the winner because it gave Hinkley Point a higher strike price. And so I worry a bit that with things like Drax coming forward, that we could see the same thing happening in the public mind, and this concern that basically we haven't learned any lessons from the mistakes of the past and are just doing the same thing again, which in turn plays into all kinds of discourses about distrust and about like who's actually benefiting and who's winning and who's losing and all of that stuff. Sorry, that was a very, very long explanation. I'm going to hand over to
There's a lot
Mike.
there, Emily. That much appreciated. And I want to build on something you said and ask Mike about it, which is, I'd be interested to know, like, psychologically, what the rationale or what caused that sort of distrust of the Hinkley Point C thing. But as a kind of layperson interpretation, I would say people like a deal, and they don't like to overpay for things, and they don't like their tax contributions being used to overpay for something. So I wanted to ask you, Mike, about this idea of price discovery. When you have one of these incentive policies, the intent is really to make sure that you're not overpaying and that a fair cost is discovered. And frankly, the real goal here is to bring the costs down. Otherwise, why would we be doing this? So can you comment a little bit on, either through past policies or just general principles or ideas that you might have, or just reactions on this idea of how do we make sure that the government isn't overpaying for something? Because that seems like a recipe for a repeat or a rhyming of history, as Emily just described the Hinkley Point C piece.
Yeah, I think what you said on Hinkley, Emily, was really interesting, because I think if you rewind a few years ago, people were talking about the early offshore wind farm contracts, which were negotiated in a similar way to the Hinkley contract, as being overpaid as well. But now no one does, because offshore wind is so much cheaper. And actually now, Eli, we do think we're probably getting a deal on offshore wind that we're not on nuclear. I guess how to do that with GGR is difficult, given kind of especially with engineered GGR, given kind of the nascent, emerging, relatively high cost field where you may have, direct air capture at hundreds of pounds a ton. You may have bioenergy with carbon capture and storage at £100 a ton. And you may have the promise of other forms of carbon dioxide removal, be it soil carbon sequestration or tree planting, which are less than £50 a ton, or in some cases probably even free by changing policy. And I think how to appraise all of that and lead to true cost discovery is difficult. But I think that doesn't mean it's not possible, right? And I think the way to do it and maintain the government's kind of upper hand, which is maybe the lesson from Hinkley, is start gradually with the promise of future expectations being larger if cost reductions are achieved. I think that's the story of offshore wind in the last few years. There, they've used competitive auctions, gradually building up volume, gradually reducing costs. And when the wind industry continues to deliver on cost reductions, you know what? The next auction, you get a few more gigawatts of offshore wind, and actually the consumer's getting a really good deal. So if you can recreate that kind of thing with GGR policy, you can have kind of the win-win from the public and industry perspective, in that you're starting to scale the industry, but you're seeing the cost reductions as well, so that future consumers are not going to be tied into these really expensive things, or they'll be tied into some really expensive things, but on a really small scale. And in the grand scheme of what they're paying for, the average cost of that is actually reasonable.
Yeah, well said. I wanted to bring in an audience question at this point, because we've been talking a lot about the consultation, which is specifically for high durability offshore storage, essentially. So it's a specific subset of greenhouse gas removal methods. So Sarmad Qureshi is asking, the GGR contracts-based approach seems to fit certain types of GGR, specifically those that involve the transport and storage of CO2, probably offshore in the UK's case. Now, of course, GGR methods have different solutions, and some, those that don't require that kind of storage, do not need this type of support. So what can be done to ensure a fully inclusive approach to supporting all types of GGR solutions? And I would editorialize slightly and ask an even bigger question, which is, should we be trying to have one policy that is a fully inclusive approach for all GGR solutions, or is there a kind of divide and conquer approach that might make more sense? Maybe start with you, Mike, and then Emily jump in.
Sure. I mean, I think it's an interesting starting point, because the UK has decided that they don't want to have one policy for all carbon dioxide removal solutions, because you've got this consultation for engineered, you've got things like the Woodland Code for tree planting, and you've also got the successor to the Common Agricultural Policy in the UK, which is going to be incentivizing other land-based greenhouse gas removal solutions. And maybe that points to an understanding within government that this is all too hard to pull together and kind of put into one policy, which I think arguably is probably the case today. In the ETC report we did on carbon dioxide removals this year, we tried to appraise all carbon dioxide removal technologies against, what is their cost today? What is their cost in the future? What is the risks around permanence? What are their other co-benefits, such as improving biodiversity, jobs, things like that? And this led to kind of a horrible slider mechanism where, there's just dots all over the place. And you look at that for a second, and all it tells you is deploy all of it, because they all have different things to offer. They have different cost profiles and they have different benefits and co-benefits. But finding a one-size-fits-all solution, at least at the moment for that, is difficult. In the very long run, I think it's probably possible. You know, you talk of integrating all of these things into, say, emissions trading schemes. I fundamentally believe that can work once you get some kind of price averaging, when you have direct air capture coming down in cost. You have probably exploited your early low-cost tree planting and soil solutions already, and you're getting into the more expensive ones of those. I think that can work, but maybe a bespoke kind of more type by type policy now is the right approach.
Excellent.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. Like, there is some debate on this. I took part in a thing a while ago, which was basically pulling together expertise to try and make comments that would feed into the CDR bit of the net zero strategy, right? And yeah, the overall conclusion that people came to was that at the moment they're just too diverse. All of these methods do different things, and you know, there's been some attempts to try and create a way of bringing permanence into the question, right? Because essentially, if you've got something that can store something not very durably for maybe 20 years, and you've got something that can store something durably for 10,000 years, you need to kind of have some sort of equivalence across that, right? And so there's all kinds of people saying, oh, well, we can put this kind of weighting metric, and we can put the CO2 removed, and we can weight it according to this. But having worked directly with natural scientists doing land-based removals, you can only do that if you actually know how long it's being stored for. And with some of these techniques, especially the newer ones, we have no clue, right? The uncertainty range is so big that it becomes completely meaningless, which completely undermines any sort of permanent weighting mechanism you might want to do. The other way you could do it is to benchmark it, right? And so this is what some companies have done. They've said, right, anything less than 1,000 years doesn't count, and others have said anything less than 100 years, and you can benchmark it in that way. But again, there's no agreement on where that benchmark should be. I just wanted to pull up on something else Mike mentioned, which was about integrating it into an emissions trading scheme, and you know, maybe this is something we can do like further down the line, I think is what you were saying. And I think there's this question of fungibility between removals and reductions that is really important in the context of mitigation deterrence or moral hazard, which some people call it. And I think this is, when we speak to publics, this is one of the biggest concerns, right? This is the biggest issue that we have with carbon removal. This is definitely the biggest issue that some of the oppositional NGOs have with carbon removal, right? This is going to be a big deal, and we need to pay attention to these problems of moral hazard, or I prefer the term mitigation deterrence, right? It's a bit more accurate.
Yeah.
And one thing that could be really damaging for that is to have this fungibility in a mechanism between removals and reductions, because what that does is it shifts attention towards the cheap, the short-term, the land-based removals that we can do, especially afforestation, and it shifts attention away from some of the mitigation measures that we can do that might actually be more expensive. And I think if any policy mechanism is perceived to be prioritizing carbon removal over forms of mitigation that are already available and that we already know how to do at scale, this could be the nail in the coffin for any carbon removal policy, right?
Yeah. There's so many things, what you said, I want to build on. I mean, that was excellent. Actually, an anonymous question did come in about how the UK should think about temporary removals versus permanent removals. And I don't want to go down that. I think Emily summarized very well, with, I think, the exception that you could, of course, require any reversal, someone to be responsible for it. So you don't necessarily have to do that setting the reversal risk up front, locking it in. You could also say, you know, one in, one out. If the carbon comes back out, someone's on the hook for it. And I think Bologna has a really excellent brief that summarizes sort of 3 different ways to think about that exact problem that Emily very well summarized.
I didn't mention producer responsibility. Miles Allen's going to kill me.
Me too. Yeah, shout out to carbon takeback as another long-term policy solution, kind of a, or even short-term, light at the end of the tunnel, if you will, because we can't just keep spending public money on this. At some point, we need to make that kind of cohesive producer responsibility piece. I wanted to go to another question that's a bit provocative and gets back into that question we had earlier about being method neutral. Tom Spencer asks, is it possible to be technology neutral? And I would say, CDR method neutral. If you treat technologies at different readiness levels the same, you bias whichever one is further ahead. If you treat them differently, you're probably not being neutral. So is technology neutrality a smokescreen? How can we understand what's going on here? And I think maybe starting with you, Mike, or Emily, but Mike, I think you mentioned earlier, or maybe it was Emily, that this might in fact be a bit of a smokescreen from government at times.
Yeah, I think it can be, and it is something that you maybe hide behind, but that is ultimately the difficulty, right? Because you want to be incentivizing things which is able to deploy and similar cost profiles, and until you have that, it is really hard to design a truly technology neutral policy. I mean, we are doing it in the UK with renewables now, and the auction that was 2 weeks ago, you had onshore solar and offshore competing in the same pot on a pure tech neutral basis, and I think that's the first time we've actually had that, and that's been a decade in the making. And let's be clear, that's because the UK wasn't active in onshore and solar policy, but it saw offshore as a low TRL technology where it had a specific role in increasing the TRL of the technology, and that's how it brought that forward. So I guess the comparison with that with GGR policy is there are GGR techniques which are at different TRLs today. Which country is going to be more active in developing which ones? And that's obviously a very hard thing to appraise, but finding the UK's niche in that and making sure that the UK focuses its additional money spent on those things where it really adds value, it is going to be really important here in that global kind of TRL story. And to offer something on that, I guess if you look for mass scale direct air capture globally, the cheapest renewables are not in the UK. So what is the answer for the UK with DAC policy? Is it do some limited this decade to bring it down the cost curve and then see what plays out with offshore wind costs? And or like I think somebody commented in the chat as well, fund it elsewhere. Fund it elsewhere where renewables are already $10 a megawatt hour, and you can really start to demonstrate DAC at scale. So it does bring into, when you think of that kind of bang for your buck innovation policy, it really does bring into these kind of decisions into account.
Yeah, maybe that just brought me in another direction, which is to think about this issue of policies that allow for the incentivization of renewables outside of a country's borders versus those that only allow it within. Of course, the atmosphere is a global commons. We should be thinking about net climate benefits, not climate benefits for a specific country. But of course, there are political motivations. And, a big part about this is to make sure that the UK can maintain a cautious or leadership position on some of this technology development. You look at the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard or a new development that's policy development in Switzerland, both of which allow for government funds to go to renewables that happen outside of the country of the origin of that policy. Emily, I'm wondering if you have a perspective on this in general, but also from the stance of, how do we make sure that the public understands the benefit when some of the purchases are happening elsewhere in a place that you can't even see? So this question of incentivizing renewables both within and outside of the boundaries of a given country.
Yeah, sure. I was at a workshop ages ago with like a load of NGO partners and a load of academics and everything like that. I was on the panel and I said, I don't per se have a problem with the UK funding a DAC project somewhere overseas. And oh my God, the gasp from the room. Like literally, it was like I committed heresy. And so I think it's just really important to recognize that different groups of people have very strong opinions on it. You get an economist in the room and they will say, absolutely, let's go wherever the energy is cheapest. Like, why would we do it in the UK? Like, we have really expensive energy costs here. This is nonsense. And so I think there's a lot of strongly embedded opinions. And I think that I don't know how we overcome that because it's based on people's values, right? Experts have values too. I think there are extremely reasonable justice concerns about funding emissions removals overseas, right? And part of the reason that some of the major NGOs are so worried about carbon removal is because they have a long history dealing with bioenergy projects, dealing with afforestation projects, dealing with palm oil, dealing with all kinds of issues that have affected the global south and caused enormous social justice problems, right? And so we have to bear that history in mind and know that some people are going to see carbon removal in exactly the same way as just a continuation of that problematic trend. You know, it's clear that I think we haven't really had this conversation with publics in the UK about these kinds of trade-offs. We know that people care a lot more about climate justice and about social justice than we like to give them credit for. We know we've got a paper on this coming out next week, actually, which shows that people get really concerned about justice issues when you start talking about CDR deployment overseas, right? But at the same time, I don't think we've really asked people how they would view that trade-off. If it was like, okay, well, what's the alternative? Well, we do it here and it's more expensive and it uses land and so forth. I don't think we've really asked that question yet.
Right. Thank you, Emily. A lot of questions came in from Ted Christie Miller and an anonymous questioner about various forms of kind of direct public procurement, right? So there's some policies that OpenAir Collective has been involved with in the US and potentially in Luxembourg, where, you know, what if government just straight up buys these carbon credits themselves? And, you know, there is an argument that if you, as one questioner puts it, you let quality insensitive buyers dominate the market, you can lead to that race to the bottom effect that we've seen in voluntary carbon markets in the past. So another alternative would be to, you know, tax and have a sort of centralized, very quality sensitive buyer of these carbon credits. Do either of you have any reactions to that question on alluding to this idea of direct public procurement, which isn't, I would say, so explicitly contemplated in this consultation at the moment?
I think it's a hard sell for government when funding is so constrained already, and ultimately there's very minimal economic benefit to paying for removals, for any wider benefit other than just getting the removals on your balance sheet. It's a difficult sell to government, but I think it ultimately, if we are serious enough globally about reducing emissions and doing enough removals for the kind of climate objectives, then you do need governments to do it. So the way I try and get around that is trying to attribute it to specific kind of goals or objectives. And I think there, for example, you could see the UK be a world leader and say, you know, we can do net zero domestically, mostly by reducing emissions, but we will need some removals, say domestically and abroad. We will have separate targets for those. And actually in the interim period, we could have removals purchased abroad, perhaps, which offset our consumption emissions or allow us to achieve an overall aggregate net zero target ahead of our 2050 date. And those kind of things, I think, would plausibly go down quite well in the public, would allow us in the UK to really kind of accelerate international as well as domestic climate ambition, as well as removals, and allow you to kind of get around that accounting, like we are actually paying for something because we're offsetting our consumption emissions as well, rather than just a payment as a means to an end, if you see what I mean. I think bringing those kind of arguments into the debate put a bit more weight behind government direct procurement of something like removals.
Great. And we're starting to run short on time. I wanted to talk about ag policy and, you know, the opportunities that are presented by the UK's exit from the Common Agricultural Policy, but we'll have to save that for another day. I wanted to kind of close, and then we'll hand back to Rory with, I'm going to use Sylvain's question, which I think is quite emotive and really captures at least how I'm feeling right now. I mean, with the heat wave, the deaths in Europe, and, you know, large sections of France literally burning. Sylvain says, you know, how do we think about public awareness and acceptance of this field we're talking about, GGR and storage? The public seems to still be quite unaware of the magnitude of climate change. Our economies are weakened by the COVID and Ukraine war, and the anti-tech movement is well-rooted. So it will not be easy for the policies we are discussing today to become real and be endorsed. And yeah, I think, you know, just anecdotally, I'm seeing so much traffic on some very kind of mainstream social media platforms where people seem to be having either climate awakenings or, let's say, kind of climate disillusionment where they're almost overwhelmed. So I'm going to challenge you both to take the kind of dark prompt that I've just given and turn it into something optimistic and positive, if you can, about, you know, how do we use and communicate the benefits of carbon removal and the policies that we've been talking about today in a way that can actually inspire faster climate action and maybe kind of meet the moment that we're having right now?
I don't mind going first on that. So first of all, I disagree that people are unaware of climate change. Certainly, our data shows complete opposite. The UK is actually, and the whole of Western Europe, including the UK, is actually a leader, if you like, on public concern about climate change. I think disillusionment that Eli mentioned is a much more serious problem, right? Because it's not that people aren't aware about climate change or that they're not worried about it. It's that we genuinely don't know what to do about it, right? And part of the issue that we've been finding when we talk to people about carbon removal is the fact that climate governance, climate policy is not really perceived as being joined up. It's not perceived as having a coherent narrative. It's not heading in the same direction. When we did some work on this, it was a few years back, and people were mentioning policies such as the support for the oil and gas sector and airport expansion. Right? And I should point out, these aren't just like liberal lefties that we're talking to here. This is like a demographically representative cross-section of the UK public. And people are still saying, well, why are we spending money on removing carbon at the same time as spending money on extracting carbon? Like, how does that even work, right? And so I think communicating the benefits of these policies has to go hand in hand with communicating a much stronger mitigation policy. And so I think what I'll end with is a question that Eli set me before this, which is, what can we do about this as advocates or as activists or whatever? And I would say we need to get out of the carbon removal bubble. It's not just about carbon removal. We need to be supporting strong mitigation policy across the board. And we need to be doing that with whatever tools we have at our disposal.
I mean,
Thank you, Emily.
I'll just echo that. I mean, I think if the way to turn this around is that the government is aware that emissions reductions is not enough alone, and they're doing their best. And let's be clear, they need to deliver against a lot of this, the stuff they say they're going to do. But we're going to need removals alongside that, and that really is a globally ambitious trajectory for the UK and the world to be on. Bringing that into the conversation and making sure the public are aware of that, and then demonstrating against it is the answer to this.
Well, thank you both. I'm going to hand back over to Rory to close us out. But just to say thank you, we are so pleased to have Dr. Emily Cox and Mike Hemsley here to join us. Thanks so much for both of your interventions. And thanks to everybody in the audience. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but as Rory will explain, there is a next step where we can keep this conversation going. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eli. Actually, I'm going to let Chris run us through this bit. So Chris, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Eli, Mike, and Emily. That was excellent. What I want to do is, obviously, there was a lot of detail and a lot of nuance that was laid on the table. And what we want to do is, at this stage, really point our interest. There's a lot to sort of take on in the UK towards a very specific advocacy effort, which we want to have underway. Just a bit of background, those of you who are familiar with OpenAir or have participated in OpenAir advocacy, we have a sort of a process that we've developed here that in which our members, anyone who has an interest, can be directly involved in the research and development of policy. There's obviously a lot of really exciting developments that are happening in the UK, but a lot that needs to be done. And what we would like to do, based on our OpenAir Carbon Gap and Foundation for Climate Restoration experience, both in the United States as well as in other countries in the European context, is to develop a very specific policy ask or proposal through our research that closes some of those gaps. I think it became clear in the discussion today that there's many different facets that have to be addressed in order to stand up an effective GGR strategy in any given national context. A key piece of that is demand support. So things like advanced market commitments or using procurement as a tool to create demand and build markets initially. So it's likely, like in other contexts, that is probably going to be the broad focus of the policy that we want to develop. So what we do is we typically take a period of about 4 to 6 weeks with small groups of our members to do research and development on a very particular policy proposal. And what we want to use is this unique window that's opened up in the UK around the Bayes comment period for GGR business models. So what the task will be is to develop a specific response to that we can submit before the deadline as a way of going public with a particular policy proposal. So if you want to participate in it, Rory, Jake, other people that are on the call can attest that it's a really interesting process, and it's a great way to really jump into the thick of GGR advocacy. So I know Jake, at a couple different times in the chat, we posted a link. It's a very short Google form, just your name, address, and where you are, essentially, if you're interested in participating in that. And what it typically looks like is we meet up once a week on Zoom in small groups and really divvy up our research needs and then get into the writing phase of it as well. And so that's what we'll be carrying out for the remainder of the summer. Our due date is at the end of September, and that's when the comment period closes for Bayes. So we have some time, but please do fill out that form if you are interested in participating. You're not signing your life away, but we will be in touch, and we'll give you some more details about how you can jump right in. So again, I want to thank everybody. It's an exciting moment. I think that there's a lot to do. And I think that the key missing piece here is really a more active grassroots response. So our hope is to get that going with folks who have joined us today. So with that, we're going to leave. We're going to wrap up right now, but I'm going to leave the Zoom on for a couple of minutes just in case folks want to grab some of the links that were shared. But again, I want to thank Rory, Eli, Michael, and Dr. Cox for joining today, and for you all joining as well. Thank you so much.